You really thought a woman like you could afford this car? Officer Daniel Mercer's voice cracked across the valet lane like a whip, sharp enough to cut through the rain and the soft jazz drifting from the hotel rooftop above. Every conversation outside the Blackstone Regency slowed. Heads turned. Phone screens lifted. Naomi Brooks stood beside the deep crimson Ferrari, one hand still resting on the driver's door, her black evening gown catching silver flashes from the patrol lights, now washing over the wet pavement. Rainwater slid down the curve of the Ferrari's hood in smooth streams, reflecting the city skyline like shattered glass. The car looked untouched. Perfect. Expensive enough to make people stare even before the police arrived. Naomi didn't answer immediately. Her expression stayed calm, unreadable, almost detached, but her eyes tracked every movement Mercer made. The officer circled the Ferrari slowly, flashlight beam gliding across the custom rims and tinted windows. His jaw tightened harder with every step. Around them, wealthy gala guests lingered beneath the hotel awning pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. A valet employee whispered something under his breath. Someone else started recording openly now. Mercer stopped beside the driver's side mirror and looked Naomi up and down with open disbelief. License and registration, he demanded. Naomi reached carefully into her clutch purse without breaking eye contact. Officer, this vehicle is federally. I didn't ask for a speech. Mercer snatched the registration from her hand before she could finish. The paper crinkled loudly in the rain. He glanced at the name once, then laughed under his breath. Registered under a shell company. That's interesting. Naomi remained still. Behind the calm in her face, a tiny pulse moved once in her jaw. Barely visible. Barely human. The earpiece hidden beneath her dark curls crackled softly for half a second before going silent again. Mercer leaned closer to the Ferrari window, shining his flashlight inside. Leather seats. A locked silver case in the passenger footwell. A second phone charging near the console. His suspicion sharpened instantly. Step away from the vehicle. Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose. Officer Mercer, she said quietly, reading his badge. Before this escalates, you need to call your supervisor. That did it. The corner of Mercer's mouth curled into something cold. Escalates, he repeated. Lady, you're already there. Thunder rolled low above downtown Atlanta as he motioned for backup. Two more patrol cars slid into the hotel entrance, lights strobing across marble columns and soaked umbrellas. The crowd widened into a loose circle now, hungry for spectacle. Naomi noticed every phone pointed at her. Every whisper. Every stare that lingered a second too long on her skin before drifting toward the Ferrari. Mercer tapped the baton once against his palm while studying the car again. Anonymous tip said this vehicle's tied to narcotics movement out of Fulton County. He announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Murmurs spread immediately. Naomi finally looked away from him and toward the street beyond the flashing lights. Somewhere 3 blocks away, a siren echoed through the wet city night. Her voice dropped lower when she spoke again. You're making a mistake. Mercer smirked. Funny thing is, he said, stepping toward the windshield, people always say that right before they get caught. Then, without warning, he brought the baton down hard against the Ferrari's side window. The crack exploded through the valet lane like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Rain immediately sprayed through the fractured glass onto the white leather interior. Naomi didn't flinch. She only stared at the spreading cracks crawling across the window while blue and red lights flickered inside her dark eyes. And for the first time that night, something dangerous moved behind her silence. The cracked window groaned softly as rain pushed deeper into the Ferrari's interior, droplets collecting along the stitched white leather like spilled mercury beneath the flashing patrol lights. Nobody moved for a second. The entire valet entrance seemed suspended in the storm, frozen between shock and anticipation. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes briefly toward the fractured glass, then back toward Officer Mercer. Her expression did not change. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Most people argued. Most people panicked when surrounded by uniforms and cameras. Naomi only stood there with rain sliding down the side of her face, calm enough to make the tension feel heavier. Mercer adjusted the body camera clip to his vest and stepped closer. Hands where I can see them. Naomi slowly raised both hands away from her sides. The diamonds around her wrist caught blue police light and scattered it across the wet pavement. Somewhere behind the crowd, a woman whispered, "That car costs more than my house." Another phone lifted higher. Mercer opened the damaged door and leaned inside the Ferrari, scanning every inch carefully now. The smell of rainwater and expensive leather drifted outward into the humid Atlanta night. He spotted the silver lockbox immediately. "What is that?" Naomi answered evenly. "Private property." Mercer laughed once without humor. "Not anymore." He motioned for another officer to bring gloves. Naomi watched the younger patrolman hesitate before obeying. He could not have been older than 25. His eyes flicked nervously between Mercer and the crowd gathering beneath the hotel canopy. Even he looked uncertain now. The gala guests had stopped pretending not to stare. Men in tuxedos and women wrapped in designer coats lingered beneath the marble awning while rain hammered the street beyond them. Their conversations had disappeared completely. Only sirens, thunder, and the clicking of phone cameras remained. Mercer pulled open the center console. A burner phone rested inside beside a thick envelope sealed with a red stripe. His posture sharpened instantly. "Well now," he muttered. Naomi said nothing. He held the burner phone up for the crowd to see, as though presenting evidence at a trial. "You want to explain this?" Naomi's gaze shifted briefly toward the hotel rooftop several stories above them. Tiny reflections moved against the dark glass windows. Watching. Waiting. The hidden earpiece beneath her curls crackled again, this time slightly longer. Mercer noticed her distraction immediately. "Who are you looking at?" Naomi returned her eyes to him. "Officer Mercer, listen carefully. You need to stop touching this vehicle." "Or what?" Her silence lasted half a beat too long. Rainwater rolled from the edge of her jaw onto the black fabric of her gown. "Or this becomes bigger than you think." Mercer's face hardened. He stepped back from the Ferrari and signaled toward the second patrol unit. "Run the registration again. Full background. I want everything." The younger officer hurried toward the cruiser. Naomi remained motionless beside the shattered window while cold wind swept through the valet lane. Her calmness no longer looked defensive. It looked controlled, deliberate. That realization began crawling slowly beneath Mercer's skin. He glanced toward the growing crowd again and noticed more cameras recording now. Not just civilians. Security personnel from the hotel. Traffic cameras mounted overhead. Reflections blinking red through the rain. Naomi followed his eyes upward for a brief moment. Then she checked the thin silver watch around her wrist. One quiet movement. One tiny glance at the time. Mercer noticed that too. "You expecting someone?" he asked sharply. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time since the window shattered. "I was hoping," she said softly, "that you would make better choices before they arrived." Officer Mercer stared at Naomi for another second before looking away first. That irritated him immediately. He was used to control. Used to people shrinking the moment his voice hardened. But Naomi Brooks stood beside the damaged Ferrari like the storm belonged to her, shoulders relaxed beneath the rain, breathing steady while police lights painted red and blue shadows across her skin. The younger patrol officer returned from the cruiser carrying a tablet already streaked with rainwater. "Sir," he said carefully, "registration came back clean." Mercer snatched the tablet from his hands. "Run it again." "I already did." Mercer scanned the screen twice. The Ferrari was registered through Hawthorne Consulting Group, a legitimate corporate entity with federal clearance exemptions attached to several transportation records. His jaw tightened harder. "That does not mean anything," he muttered. Naomi lowered her hands slowly now that no one had ordered them raised again. "I told you this situation was bigger than a traffic stop." Mercer ignored her. "Search the vehicle." The younger officer hesitated again. "Sir, without a warrant, you see probable cause standing right in front of you." The words came out louder than necessary. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably beneath the awning. Naomi watched the younger officer carefully. He looked embarrassed now. Not frightened. Embarrassed. Rain hammered the sidewalk harder as thunder rolled across downtown Atlanta again, vibrating through the glass entrance behind them. Mercer opened the silver lockbox himself. The hinges clicked softly beneath the flashing lights. Inside sat stacks of bundled cash, several passports, and a compact hard drive sealed in evidence plastic. The air around the valet lane changed instantly. Even the crowd reacted differently now. Phones lifted higher. Whispers spread faster. Mercer stared into the box with growing satisfaction. Well. Naomi's expression never changed. Close the case. Excuse me. You should not have opened that. Mercer held up one passport. Multiple identities? Another officer stepped closer to look. This is enough for detainment right there. Mercer looked back toward Naomi with renewed confidence now, almost relieved to finally feel the balance shifting his way again. You want to explain why you are carrying enough cash to buy a house? Naomi glanced once toward the evidence case, still sitting open in the rain. Water collected slowly along the edges of the bundled bills. Because none of that belongs to me. Mercer laughed sharply. That is your defense. No, she replied quietly. That is your problem. The younger patrol officer shifted his weight uneasily. Sir, maybe we should call a supervisor. Mercer rounded on him instantly. What exactly do you think I am doing here? The younger man fell silent. Naomi noticed his name tag under the rain. Officer Ruiz. Barely older than 25. Still young enough to doubt himself when things stopped making sense. Mercer pointed toward Naomi again. Turn around. She did not move immediately. The rain softened slightly now, becoming a cold mist drifting beneath the hotel lights. Somewhere farther down the block, engines rumbled low through the night traffic. Naomi finally turned slowly, placing her hands behind her back without resistance. Mercer reached for the cuffs attached to his belt while speaking loudly enough for every camera nearby to hear. Naomi Brooks, you are being detained pending investigation into narcotics trafficking and financial crimes. Naomi closed her eyes briefly as the metal clicked around her wrists. Not fear, not panic, more like disappointment. Mercer noticed that too, though he did not understand why it unsettled him. Then the hidden earpiece beneath Naomi's curls crackled one final time. This time Mercer heard it clearly. A faint voice, distorted by static. Agent Brooks, status check. Everything inside Officer Mercer seemed to stop for half a heartbeat. Naomi slowly opened her eyes again and stared straight ahead into the rain while traffic lights reflected across the wet street like lines of burning color. Then, very softly, almost gently, she spoke. Too late. The rain seemed quieter after that single sentence, as if even the storm itself had paused to listen. Officer Mercer stared at Naomi Brooks while cold water dripped from the edge of his jaw onto the front of his uniform. What did you just say? Naomi did not answer immediately. The cuffs around her wrists reflected blue police light each time the patrol cars rotated across the soaked street. Around them, the crowd had gone strangely still. Even the people filming appeared uncertain now, phones hovering in midair as tension spread through the valet lane like smoke. Officer Ruiz looked between Mercer and Naomi with growing confusion. Sir, he said carefully, I heard that too. Mercer snapped toward him. Heard what? Ruiz hesitated. The voice in her earpiece. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. He stepped toward Naomi again, closer this time, searching her face for fear, arrogance, anything he could recognize and control. Instead, he found composure, calm breathing, steady eyes, the kind of stillness that came from preparation, not panic. Naomi lifted her gaze toward him slowly. Take the cuffs off. Mercer let out a short laugh that sounded thinner than before. You are not in a position to make demands. No, Naomi replied quietly. You are not in a position to understand what is happening. Thunder rolled again above downtown Atlanta, deeper now, vibrating through the marble columns of the Blackstone Regency. Water streamed from the shattered Ferrari window into the leather interior while the evidence lockbox remained open beside the driver's seat. Bundled cash, burner phones, passports, every item glistening beneath the rain and flashing lights. Mercer suddenly became aware of how exposed everything looked. How public. Traffic cameras blinked overhead. Hotel security cameras faced directly toward the valet entrance. At least 30 civilians were still recording. He turned sharply toward Ruiz. Get those people back. But nobody moved, because at that exact moment, black SUVs appeared at the far end of the street. 3 of them, dark headlights cutting through rain like blades. The engines rolled low and controlled as they approached the hotel entrance without sirens. Mercer watched them instinctively, every muscle tightening beneath his soaked uniform. The SUVs stopped hard against the curb. Doors opened immediately. Men and women in dark jackets stepped into the rain with the kind of precision that silenced a street without a single shouted order. Yellow letters caught the flashing patrol lights across their backs. FBI. The entire crowd recoiled at once. Phones lowered. Conversations vanished. Officer Ruiz stepped backward before he even realized he was moving. Mercer remained frozen beside Naomi. A tall woman with silver streaks in her dark hair emerged from the lead SUV and walked directly toward them through the rain. Her expression was carved from stone. "Who is commanding officer here?" Mercer swallowed once before speaking. "I am." She flashed credentials so quickly only trained eyes could follow them. Special Agent Evelyn Ross. Her gaze shifted instantly toward Naomi standing cuffed beside the damaged Ferrari. For the first time all night, emotion crossed someone's face. Anger. Sharp and immediate. Ross looked back at Mercer slowly. "Why is Agent Brooks in restraints?" The question landed harder than a shout. Mercer opened his mouth, but no words came immediately. Behind him, the shattered Ferrari window creaked softly as rainwater continued dripping into the vehicle. Ross stepped closer now, eyes moving toward the open lockbox and the scattered evidence exposed to the storm. Her jaw tightened visibly. "Tell me," she said carefully, "that you did not compromise a live federal operation in the middle of downtown Atlanta." Mercer felt every camera nearby turn toward him at once. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward Agent Ross. Water slid from her curls onto her shoulders while the metal cuffs remained motionless behind her back. "I warned him," she said softly. Nobody in the valet lane spoke after that. Only the sound of rain striking broken glass filled the silence. Officer Mercer suddenly became aware of everything at once. The shattered Ferrari window. The open evidence case filling with rainwater. The dozens of cameras pointed directly at him. The silver handcuffs locked around the wrists of a federal agent standing perfectly still beneath flashing patrol lights. His throat tightened hard. Special Agent Evelyn Ross stepped past him without waiting for permission and moved directly toward Naomi. "Are you hurt?" Naomi shook her head once. "No, ma'am." Ross glanced briefly toward the cracked side window of the Ferrari and the soaked evidence exposed inside the vehicle. Her face darkened further. "The operation?" Naomi's eyes shifted toward the open lockbox. "Compromised." Those single words landed heavier than the thunder overhead. Mercer felt his stomach drop before he fully understood why. Ross turned back toward him slowly. "Do you have any idea what this operation was tied to?" Mercer forced his posture straighter. "I received a narcotics alert tied to the vehicle." "From who?" He hesitated. "Anonymous dispatch tip." Ross stepped closer now. Close enough that rain rolled from the brim of Mercer's cap onto the front of her coat. "There was no authorized dispatch request tonight." Mercer blinked once. "What?" "Which means," Ross continued coldly, "someone inside your department redirected you here intentionally." The words seemed to hollow the air around him. Officer Ruiz looked visibly pale now beside the patrol car. "Sir," Mercer ignored him. His eyes shifted instinctively back toward Naomi Brooks. She stood silent in the rain, soaked black fabric clinging to her shoulders, while broken blue and red reflections flickered across her face. But now Mercer finally saw something he had missed earlier. Not arrogance, not fear, exhaustion, the kind carried by someone who had spent months walking inside dangerous places without ever being allowed to react emotionally. Ross motioned sharply toward the cuffs. "Remove them." Mercer's hands suddenly felt stiff as he reached for the key at his belt. The metal clicked softly as the restraints fell away from Naomi's wrists. She rubbed the faint red marks once, but said nothing. No anger. No speech. Somehow that made the shame worse. Ross looked toward the Ferrari again. How much of the evidence chain was exposed? Naomi glanced into the ruined interior. Enough. Rainwater dripped steadily onto the burner phones and bundled cash still sitting inside the open lockbox. One of the passports had already warped from moisture. Ross closed her eyes briefly. Damn it. A deep silence spread again across the valet lane. Nobody in the crowd seemed interested in recording anymore. The excitement had drained away, replaced by something uncomfortable and human. Officer Mercer stood motionless beside the shattered vehicle while realization slowly settled across his face piece by piece. Anonymous tip. No dispatch authorization. A federal sting operation. His breathing became shallower. I was set up. Ross looked at him evenly. No, Officer Mercer. You were manipulated. The distinction hit harder than an accusation. Naomi finally looked toward him again for the first time since the FBI arrived. Rain slid down her face beneath the hotel lights, softening nothing. You saw an expensive car, she said quietly. You saw a black woman standing beside it. And you stopped asking questions after that. Mercer opened his mouth, but no defense came. Because somewhere beneath the humiliation and panic rising inside him, he knew she was right. The younger Officer Ruiz lowered his eyes toward the pavement. The crowd remained silent. Even the city itself seemed quieter now beneath the rain. Then Ross's phone vibrated sharply in her coat pocket. She answered immediately. Her expression changed within seconds. Understood, she said. Lock down every responding officer from Mercer's precinct until internal affairs arrives. Mercer's head snapped upward. Ross ended the call slowly and looked directly at him. The anonymous tip originated from inside your division. The blood drained from Mercer's face. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward the flashing patrol lights reflecting in puddles around their feet. They needed someone emotional enough to ruin the operation, she said softly. They chose correctly. The rain finally began to soften sometime after midnight, falling now in thin silver lines beneath the hotel lights instead of violent sheets. The energy around the Blackstone Regency had changed completely. The crowd was gone. The phones were gone. Even the patrol cars looked quieter parked against the curb with their lights dimmed low across the wet street. Only the shattered Ferrari remained exactly where it had been, water still dripping steadily through the fractured window onto the ruined leather seats inside. Naomi Brooks stood beside the vehicle with her arms folded loosely against the cold. A dark FBI jacket now rested over her shoulders, though strands of damp hair still clung to her skin from the storm. Nearby, federal agents moved carefully around the scene collecting evidence into sealed containers, speaking in low controlled voices that barely carried beyond the sidewalk. Officer Mercer sat alone on the edge of the curb several feet away from everyone else. No one had told him to sit there. No one needed to. His soaked uniform clung heavily to him now, darker under the fading patrol lights. The adrenaline was gone. In its place sat something slower and harder to escape. Shame. He watched silently as one of the FBI technicians lifted the ruined burner phones from the Ferrari using gloves. Another photographed the cracked side window from multiple angles. Every flash from the camera reflected briefly in Mercer's eyes before disappearing again. Officer Ruiz remained near the 2nd Patrol Unit, speaking quietly with internal affairs investigators who had arrived 20 minutes earlier. He avoided looking toward Mercer completely. Naomi noticed that. She noticed everything. That had been part of the job for too long now. Special Agent Ross stepped beside her, holding 2 paper coffee cups. Steam curled upward into the cold night air. You should get inside, Ross said softly. Naomi accepted the coffee, but did not drink it. Not yet. Ross followed her gaze toward Mercer, sitting motionless beside the curb. You warned him 3 times. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose. People hear what they expect to hear. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Downtown Atlanta hummed quietly around them now. Distant traffic passing through wet intersections while rainwater trickled into storm drains along the street. Somewhere above, the hotel rooftop band had finally stopped playing hours ago. The city felt emptied out. Ross glanced toward the damaged Ferrari again. 6 months undercover, she said quietly. Gone in 10 minutes. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the cracked glass scattered along the pavement. Tiny pieces reflected the streetlights like ice. Not 10 minutes, she replied. Years. Ross studied her carefully then. You are thinking about your father again. Naomi did not answer right away. She watched rain slide from the edge of the Ferrari door in slow, steady drops. He wore a badge for 23 years, she said finally. Spent half his career proving he belonged in rooms that never wanted him there. Her voice stayed calm, but something heavier moved underneath it now. And every time he came home angry, he said the same thing. Ross remained silent. Naomi's eyes stayed fixed on the broken car window. He said prejudice makes people careless. Eventually, careless people expose themselves. Across the curb, Mercer lowered his head further into his hands. The words had carried farther than Naomi intended. Or maybe exactly as far as she intended. Ross noticed him react immediately. So did Naomi. A long silence followed. Then Mercer slowly stood from the curb. His movements looked older somehow. Slower. He walked toward Naomi carefully, stopping several feet away beneath the pale glow of the hotel entrance. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap onto the sidewalk between them. For a second, he looked like he wanted to speak and could not remember how. Naomi met his eyes calmly. No anger. no triumph. That somehow made the silence between them feel even heavier. Officer Mercer stopped several feet from Naomi Brooks, close enough to see the raindrops trembling along her eyelashes beneath the hotel lights. The city noise around them had faded into something distant and hollow now, as though downtown Atlanta itself understood this was no longer about flashing patrol cars or broken glass. This was about a man realizing exactly who he had become in front of strangers. Mercer removed his cap slowly. Water streamed from the brim onto the pavement between them. His hands looked unsteady for the first time all night. "Agent Brooks," he said quietly, the title sounding unfamiliar in his mouth now. "I need to know something." Naomi waited. Mercer glanced once toward the ruined Ferrari before continuing. "If I had stepped out of that car tonight instead of you, if I had been standing there in a suit beside a $200,000 vehicle," his voice tightened slightly, "would this still have happened?" The question hung in the cold air longer than either of them expected. Naomi studied him silently while rain tapped softly against the marble hotel entrance behind them. Special Agent Ross remained several feet away speaking with internal affairs investigators, but even she looked up briefly when Mercer asked it. Because everyone there already knew the answer. Mercer just needed to hear it out loud. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the shattered glass scattered near the curb. Tiny pieces sparkled beneath the streetlights like fragments of ice. "No," she said softly. Mercer closed his eyes for a second. Not long. Just enough for the truth to land fully this time. When he opened them again, something defensive inside him was finally gone. "I thought I was a good cop," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked back at him. Most people do before somebody gets hurt. The words were not cruel. That made them worse. Mercer swallowed hard and glanced toward the FBI technicians still photographing the damaged evidence containers. "Did I destroy the whole case?" Naomi followed his gaze toward the Ferrari. No, Mercer looked surprised for the first time all night. Naomi folded her arms tighter against the cold wind drifting through the valet lane. "The operation was already compromised before you arrived. Someone inside your precinct leaked my location 2 hours earlier." Mercer stared at her. "Then why were you still here?" Naomi's expression shifted slightly then, something more tired than angry crossing her face. "Because the money transfer still mattered. We were tracking officers taking protection payments through shell companies tied to narcotics distribution." Mercer's breathing slowed as pieces began connecting inside his mind. Anonymous dispatch tip. Federal clearance records. Burner phones. Ross walked closer now, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement. "Your division was under investigation for 14 months, she said evenly. Mercer looked genuinely stunned. 14, Ross nodded once. "You were never a target, Officer Mercer. You were background noise." The words hit him harder than accusation ever could have. Naomi glanced toward him briefly. "Until tonight." A bitter silence settled over the sidewalk. Mercer looked down at his own reflection, trembling in a rain puddle near the curb. Distorted by patrol lights. Distorted by water. Distorted by choices made too quickly. "Who leaked your location?" he asked finally. Ross answered this time. "Captain Warren Ellis." Mercer's head snapped upward instantly. "Ellis." Ross nodded again. "Internal Affairs picked him up 20 minutes ago, trying to leave the city." Mercer looked physically sick now. Captain Ellis had trained him, recommended him for promotion, sat beside him at department charity dinners. Naomi watched realization move slowly across Mercer's face piece by piece. He knew exactly which officer to send after me, she said quietly. Mercer did not deny it, because now he understood something even uglier than corruption. Ellis had not chosen him because he was violent. He had chosen him because he was predictable. The rain finally stopped completely then. For the first time all night, the city became still. Mercer stared at Naomi Brooks beneath the fading police lights and realized the people who manipulated him had never needed to force anything at all. They had simply trusted his assumptions to do the work for them. The last FBI technician finally closed the evidence cases just after 1 in the morning. The flashing lights that had painted the Blackstone Regency all night began disappearing one by one as patrol units pulled away from the curb. Wet pavement stretched quietly beneath the streetlights now, reflecting long silver streaks where rainwater still clung to the road. Naomi Brooks stood beside the damaged Ferrari while a tow truck operator carefully inspected the shattered window and dented door panel. The car no longer looked untouchable. It looked tired, used, human somehow. Special Agent Ross stepped toward the waiting SUVs near the corner, leaving Naomi alone for the first time since the operation collapsed. Across the sidewalk, Officer Mercer remained standing near the curb with his cap tucked beneath one arm. Internal Affairs investigators had already collected his body camera and service paperwork. He looked strangely smaller without all of it. Less like authority, more like a man trying to understand the shape of his own mistakes. Naomi turned slightly when she heard footsteps approaching again. Mercer stopped beside the ruined Ferrari, careful not to stand too close this time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Downtown Atlanta breathed softly around them through distant traffic and humming streetlights. The storm was over. Only water dripping from awnings and tree branches remained. Mercer stared at the cracked window for several long seconds before finally speaking. "My father was a cop too." Naomi said nothing. Mercer gave a faint, humorless laugh. "He used to tell me that instincts kept officers alive." He glanced down at the wet pavement. "I think somewhere along the line I stopped learning the difference between instinct and assumption." Naomi watched him quietly. His voice no longer carried defensiveness now, just exhaustion. "Captain Ellis knew exactly what kind of officer I was," Mercer admitted. "He knew I would see what he wanted me to see." Naomi folded her arms loosely against the cool night air. "That does not remove your responsibility." "I know." The answer came immediately. Honest. Raw. Mercer looked toward her fully for the first time since the FBI arrived. "I embarrassed you tonight." Naomi's eyes shifted briefly toward the empty street, where dozens of people had stood filming her earlier beneath the rain. "You humiliated yourself," she replied softly. The words should have sounded cruel. Somehow they did not. Mercer lowered his gaze again. "I do not expect forgiveness." Naomi looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Good." A cold breeze drifted through the valet lane, carrying the faint smell of rain and gasoline. Somewhere farther down the block, a traffic signal clicked from red to green across an empty intersection. Mercer rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. "What happens now?" Naomi glanced toward the FBI SUVs waiting under the streetlights. "Internal Affairs investigates your division. Federal prosecutors move on the corruption cases. The city pretends to be shocked for about 2 weeks." Mercer almost smiled at that, but the expression faded before it fully formed. "And me?" Naomi looked directly at him now. "Calm. Steady. That depends on what kind of man you become after tonight." The silence that followed felt different from the others. Not hostile. Not tense. Just honest. Mercer nodded slowly as though accepting something painful but necessary. Then his eyes drifted once more toward the shattered Ferrari. "I am going to pay for the damage." Naomi followed his gaze toward the broken glass glittering beneath the streetlights. The window was not the expensive part. Mercer frowned slightly. Naomi's voice stayed quiet when she continued. "Trust is." The words settled heavily between them. Mercer looked like he wanted to answer, but none came. Because deep down he understood she was no longer talking about the car. A tow truck winch clicked softly as the Ferrari was slowly lifted from the wet pavement. Naomi watched the vehicle rise inch by inch beneath the pale city lights while reflections shimmered across the cracked glass like fading lightning. Then, after a long silence, Mercer spoke one final time. "For what it is worth, I am sorry I saw your skin before I saw you." Naomi looked at him carefully, and for the first time all night, something in her expression softened just enough to be human. By the time dawn began rising over downtown Atlanta, the streets around the Blackstone Regency had almost emptied completely. The storm clouds were gone now, replaced by a pale gray sky slowly brightening above the city skyline. Water still shimmered across the pavement where the rain had passed hours earlier, turning the streets into long mirrors beneath the quiet morning light. The tow truck carrying the damaged Ferrari disappeared around the corner with a low mechanical hum, leaving behind only scattered droplets of glass that city workers quietly swept from the curb. Naomi Brooks stood alone beneath the hotel awning for a moment, watching the sunrise reflect across the wet intersections ahead. The city looked softer at this hour, cleaner somehow, as if night had washed something away. Behind her, federal agents loaded the last sealed evidence containers into black SUVs, while internal affairs investigators escorted officers one by one into separate vehicles for questioning. Nobody raised their voice anymore. Nobody needed to. The truth had already done its work. Naomi adjusted the FBI jacket around her shoulders, and slowly descended the hotel steps toward the street. Her heels clicked softly against the damp pavement. Across the road, Officer Daniel Mercer remained beside a dark sedan, waiting to transport him downtown for formal interviews. He had not moved much in the last 20 minutes. His cap rested beneath his arm again, his soaked uniform now wrinkled and heavy beneath the early morning light. When he noticed Naomi approaching, he straightened instinctively before stopping himself halfway through the motion. Old habits. Naomi stopped several feet away from him. Traffic lights changed silently behind them from red to green across an almost empty intersection. Somewhere nearby, a subway train rumbled faintly beneath the city streets. Mercer looked exhausted now. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone who had spent an entire night watching the version of himself he believed in slowly collapse piece by piece. Internal Affairs says I will probably be suspended pending review, he said quietly. Naomi nodded once, neither surprised nor pleased, just accepting reality as it stood. Mercer glanced toward the brightening skyline. Funny thing is, I spent years believing corruption looked obvious. His voice carried no bitterness now, only reflection. Thought it was money under tables, secret meetings, dirty cops in dark alleys. He lowered his eyes briefly. Turns out sometimes it is just assumptions people stop questioning. Naomi studied him carefully. The city wind lifted a few damp curls from her face before settling again. Bias rarely announces itself, she said softly. It survives by sounding reasonable. Mercer absorbed the words in silence. A long one. Then he looked toward her again. Do you think somebody like me can change? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out across the awakening city while sunlight slowly spread along the tops of the buildings downtown. Golden reflections stretched across windows still wet from the storm. My father used to say character is not revealed when life is easy, she said finally. It is revealed the moment truth becomes uncomfortable. Mercer listened quietly. Naomi's eyes returned to him. Calm, steady, human. What you do after tonight matters more than what happened during it. For the first time since the traffic stop began hours earlier, Mercer's shoulders loosened slightly. Not relief, just understanding. A black SUV pulled forward beside Naomi then, engine humming softly. Special Agent Ross waited inside. Naomi reached for the door handle before pausing one last time. Mercer stood silently beneath the fading glow of the streetlights. The same man, and yet somehow not the same at all. Naomi looked at him for another second, then gave a small nod. Not forgiveness, not approval, something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Then she stepped into the SUV and closed the door softly behind her. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the slow-moving morning traffic, while sunlight spilled fully across the city at last. Mercer remained standing alone on the sidewalk long after the SUV vanished from view. Around him, Atlanta continued waking up. Car horns echoed faintly in the distance. Coffee shops unlocked their doors. Steam rose from storm drains into the cool morning air. And beneath the soft gold light of sunrise, tiny fragments of shattered glass still sparkled quietly near the curb where assumptions had finally broken apart.